Welcome back. Today we're discussing one of the most challenging moments in leadership, when someone reports being harassed, discriminated against, or harmed at work. How you respond in that moment matters immensely. It can determine whether that person feels supported or re-traumatized. It can influence whether they're able to recover and continue working, or whether they feel pushed out. And it shapes whether others in your workplace feel safe coming forward. This episode is about trauma-informed leadership, understanding how trauma affects people, knowing how to respond with compassion and competence, and recognizing your own limits and support needs as a leader. Kasumi Ejiri is the Director of Integrated Practice at the Women's Legal Centre ACT and has had a transformative impact since joining the centre in 2019. Working collaboratively with senior colleagues, Kasumi has led the development of the centre as a multidisciplinary trauma-informed organisation. This includes recognising the prevalence and impacts of trauma and driving a commitment to reflective practice. Under her leadership, the centre has emerged as an example of best practice, boasting a groundbreaking framework that integrates legal experts with the invaluable perspectives of social workers and other professionals. Welcome, Kasumi. Welcome, Kasumi. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Really keen to hear from your perspective and all of your work in this space. How do you create an environment where people feel safe to disclose?
Well, this took me back to a couple of years ago when we started our sexual violence legal service at the Women's Legal Centre in Canberra. And it was interesting, although we've been working in the space of domestic and family violence for a really long time, and that was really our bread and butter, violence against women, there's something about the personal invasion of sexual violence that we suddenly realised, these, of course, we're looking at the statistics, of course, this has affected many of our staff members, most of whom identify as female. And so we realised that we really had to be really careful in how to do this. And so we sought out some expert support. We got all our supervisors and leaders to do specific training on how to respond to disclosures of sexual violence. And then we let all our staff know that, look, we're opening up this legal service. This is something that is happening in several different women's legal centres across Australia. But we realised that, this is going to be confronting for some people for different reasons, in different ways. And it was interesting because I think for some people, it was like they didn't even know they were having a reaction, but you kind of feel something different in the air. Yes. And we just said to everybody, look, please feel like you can come and speak to somebody. We set up a specific, not like a counselling or an EAP service, but we set up an anonymous phone number that people could call, which sent them through to a specialist sexual violence trauma counsellor. And we said, look, you can speak to them 2 or 3 times. The centre will pay for it. The centre will not know who has called or how many times. And just so you know, there will be supports if you want to stay, but then we will, if this ends up being a workplace that you can't be at anymore because this is the work that we're doing, then we will also provide supports to leave. So it was, we tried to really skill up our leaders, skill up the supervisors, but really create a process that people knew where they were going to get supported, whichever way was going to be the right thing for them.
That's so powerful. And I think even just recognising kind of the need for an anonymous support, but also making sure that support is trauma-informed. Often a lot of workplaces will have EAP services, which is fantastic, but EAP provides, advice on a range of things, and providing trauma counselling, especially around family and domestic violence and sexual violence, very different to, providing kind of, financial counselling to somebody that might be feeling it. Yeah, I think that's one of the things when I've worked in-house in organisations that I've asked, what's the background and the expertise? Do we actually have anyone as part of your provider service that does have a trauma background or has worked in family or sexual violence? Because too often I think workplaces aren't necessarily thinking through what expertise or what support their EAP providers might have. But having that separate line and doing all of that work, recognising, right, we need to upskill leaders. We need to also recognise that, yes, this might not be a place that people can work anymore. That sounds like a fantastic model.
And I think providing choice is also really important. Like we have our EAP and we've always kept that live, although it is a bit hit and miss who ends up picking up the phone. We also reminded everybody that we've got our individual reflective practice facilitators that people could also contact anonymously. They could speak to their supervisor, who we also provided training to. But then we also reminded everybody about our mental health wellbeing allowance.
Yes.
Which means that people can go and see a counsellor of their choosing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's fantastic to hear. I'm really keen to hear, I guess, and this model's been in place for some time now, that the legal service is looking at sexual violence. Is that right?
So I'm trying to think. I think the sexual violence legal service, we started up in 2023. So I think it's at least a couple of years old now. So this is work that we were doing, about 2 years ago.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I guess in that context, but also more broadly, how do you balance being supportive but also maintaining professional boundaries?
Yeah, we're very conscious of the fact that our organisation is impacted on a daily basis by gender-based trauma, and that this is it's not a theoretical thing for our staff.
Yes.
We live in a patriarchal society. And therefore, we have all been impacted by gender-based violence in one way or another. And so this is, a very real and for some people, a very visceral thing. And one of the ways that we can, that support, one of the things that really supports our trauma-informed organisation is having quite a collegial, supportive relationships with our colleagues. And sometimes, because we work with such wonderful women, you want to be friends with everybody. But yeah, I think there's a difference between being friendly and supportive and a good supervisor who's approachable with things, but also kind of not crossing into that boundary of being friends, where it's kind of, I do struggle with this, to be honest, because you also want to be an authentic supervisor, an authentic leader. So you want to share bits of yourself, but you don't want to share too much. And you want people to be able to tell you things and disclose some things that are going to really affect the way that they're turning up for work. But also, of course, you don't want to know too much. You want to be able to understand what is going on, how it's going to impact their work, and then be able to offer them other services and choices and supports that might be able to help them with some of the deeper things.
So it sounds like it's an ongoing practice. It's not something that you can kind of try and set a boundary and see how that goes or take a particular approach. It might require some reflection over time, and I'm sure every relationship is a little bit unique in terms of managing different staff. But yes, I suppose you've got your manager hat on, but you've also got your colleague hat on. Yeah. And yeah, it sounds like a bit of a juggle to kind of balance and make sure that people do have that.
It changes over time as well, because you kind of work with colleagues and then, and then you move into different roles and suddenly the power dynamic is a little bit different. And, so you kind of have to feel your way into what the new structure is. And then, for some staff members who have left, and then it's like, we can be friends now.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the professional hat in that context is challenging, especially in workplaces and environments where you have, your values aligned, you have a lot in common, and often when I've worked either in-house in nonprofits or anything like, or a lot of workplaces, there is that, we're working towards the same outcome. And, you find your tribe, so to speak. And so to kind of set some professional boundaries in that context can be tricky, but really keen to unpack and understand what are some of the common mistakes that leaders might make when someone discloses harassment or any form of gendered violence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's the really obvious, like, not believing, or the minimizing. And I think that maybe when it's like, when you have a client come to see you to access your service, you're almost armed, for a disclosure. But when it's a colleague, and you're having conversations of all different kinds all the time, and it comes unexpectedly, sometimes you react rather than respond.
Sure.
And I think in those moments, sometimes the wrong thing might unintentionally minimize or unintentionally say something that doesn't land. And I think it's okay in those moments to kind of just say, I'm sorry, that didn't come out the way that I needed it to.
Sure.
And I'm sorry I said that, and kind of make a difference, because I think that interaction is also part of trauma-informed practice of just knowing that, we're all humans.
Yeah.
And whatever our different life experiences are, that affects how we come to whatever interaction today. And that's, sometimes it's going to land really well, and sometimes we're not going to quite get it right.
Sure.
But just having that humility sometimes, I think, really can make.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, and something that we touched on in episode 3 around kind of being a bystander, and that we're all open to. Often we have a lot of barriers that are put up around, I'm going to say the wrong thing, or, maybe I'll get the language wrong and I don't want to make a mistake. So, I think just however you do respond, being open and reflective, but demonstrating some humility. I think that's really powerful, that, of course, we are going to make mistakes. We're not perfect beings, and, trauma-informed practice isn't perfect from the outset. It's a practice over time that, things are going to move and shift over time. So thank you for sharing that. So from your experience, what are some of the examples of trauma-informed leadership in practice?
Well, I guess the way that we have thought about trauma-informed practice is that it has, it all comes down to the trauma-informed principles. And for us, the overarching principle is safety. And then underneath that, we've got collaboration, choice, and trustworthiness. And the way that I talk about it is, if all those three things are happening nicely in unison, then you're, supporting empowerment as well. Yeah. And so we try and put, like, rather than, for example, when we're writing policies, rather than tokenistically saying we are trauma-informed or using the term trauma-informed, what we would rather do is actually start using what, these principal words, or, actually providing choice and, starting with client safety, starting with staff safety and things like this. And so one of the things, for example, that we did during the COVID lockdown period was, everybody had to go home and work by themselves. And actually the number of calls that came to the centre really skyrocketed. So people wanted to know what to do about their parenting matters when you couldn't go between houses. Violence really peaked during this time where everybody was experiencing a lot of stress and in the home and didn't have places to go. And we were really conscious that our staff were also feeling the effects of the pandemic themselves.
Absolutely.
Some people had their families with them. Some people were living by themselves. People were in all different kinds of circumstances. People needed different staff needed different supports during that time. People had different anxiety levels about what was happening. And so this was a time that actually reflective practice really got embedded within our organisation. So up until then, we'd done quite a lot of group reflective practice.
Sure.
But then once everybody was working from home for those months, we really needed to think about how we're going to keep our staff safe, how we're going to be able to check in. We were really lucky that we had all the systems where we were, in contact with each other really regularly. But we got a reflective practice facilitator to check in on every single staff member at least once a fortnight.
Oh, fantastic.
And this was somebody that the organisation already knew. She had already built a lot of trust with many of us. And we really opened it up to sort of say, look, normally reflective practice would have a real, more of a focus on work and systems and the impact of work. But, we really know that home life and work life is really getting enmeshed and tangled. And so, we really wanted to give everybody permission to open up that scope of the conversation.
Sure.
So people were getting the supports that they needed. This was the time that I think that we introduced the wellbeing allowance, and the mental health allowance might have come a little bit later. And we were also providing a lot of strategies for people. So, for example, try and create a transition between coming to work and leaving work. Whether that be a walk around the block, whether, and it's actually useful if it's something quite physical and in your body. So some people were like, I'm going to change my clothes before, or for some people, it was even just like brushing their teeth, because it was just like, this is something that's happening in my body and I'm kind of feeling it. And it creates a little break between work and the content of that gender-based violence and the home life.
Sure.
And so, we were really lucky, I think, that COVID was actually a time that I think most people were feeling really supported by work. So it actually was a time that, people built a lot of trust with the organisation. And so we've had a lot of long stayers from the period as well.
That's fantastic. And amazing to hear that the facilitator that was involved in that process kind of knew the organisation and had some established trust already.
Yeah.
I think what I've seen sometimes is that that trust has been assumed, or it might be there in patches for some, but actually it's, trustworthiness is, such a key and foundational trauma-informed principle. But I think sometimes it might get overlooked by some, or that, okay, yes, we as leaders have decided that, we're going to invest in these things now, but actually there's perhaps people that have been disappointed or even harmed by previous processes or systems and structures that, might be a little bit resistant to, something new that's coming in that for all intents and purposes might be really helpful, but there hasn't been that acknowledgement of actually we know that, we might have let you down in how we responded before, or this system hasn't worked, and we understand that this has had this flow and effect. And I think that's one of the key things when I try and work with people, that it's, please don't assume that trust exists.
Yeah.
And you only have to look often at engagement surveys, and you can see that there's not that great a sense of psychological safety, or, people might not have witnessed poor behaviour, but they don't really have any trust in the organisation to do something about it. So, that example, and especially during a time of COVID, I think the wellbeing allowances and the mental health allowances were starting to crop up a whole lot more for lots of different workplaces, which was great. But yeah, that's really powerful. And so that reflective practice now at an individual level, has that continued now that we're, kind of more post-COVID? And
yeah, so we have continued to really heavily invest in reflective practice. So There's group reflective practice. There are individual reflective practice sessions. We try and encourage everybody to do a bit of both.
Yes.
Because as a group, you can really kind of look at systems that are happening within the organisation, get people from different teams, different parts of the organisation to connect. This has become more and more important as the organisation has grown bigger.
Sure.
So I think during COVID, we might have been like 12, 15 people. Now we're closer to 50.
Yeah.
And so actually kind of growing this, and trying to nurture the culture that we created when we were nice and small, and keeping certain things alive has been a challenge at times. And also actually, the reflective practice facilitator that we had during COVID times wasn't able to continue supporting the growing organisation. It just wasn't possible.
Yeah.
And so we've had to go to a panel of reflective practice facilitators, each of whom have a different style of doing things. So this has kind of affected, how things are practiced as well. And there's been, change and some good things that have happened with that as well.
Yeah, well, instills choice, I guess, as well. Like if people do have different preferences for how things go about, I guess if you've got a panel, hopefully that does give people, especially for individual sessions, that flexibility or choice about who it is that they might work with.
Yeah, and we try to get as much diversity within that panel to increase choice. We also have cultural supervisors for all of our First Nations staff. Our social workers have their external clinical supervisors, and they're able to choose whoever they want. So we try and really keep that choice element as open as possible, because I think that can make a big difference to people. People need different kinds of supports depending on what's going on for them. And so things like even just flexible work arrangements, that can be a big part of having a trauma-informed organisation, particularly when you're employing women who have caring responsibilities and different things happening in their lives. And thinking about what leave do you offer, and what are the different options, and how else is it that the organisation can really provide care.
Yes. Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you. You've just mentioned that we need to, think through a variety of different support options and cater to different needs. But what have you seen that works, or any kind of insights about how leaders can sustain themselves, when they're trying to adopt trauma-informed practice, and how can they look after themselves?
Well, it's really how can everybody look after themselves. When I think back to how we started our journey on trauma-informed practice, it started with how can we manage challenging client behaviour, which is actually how I think a lot of people come to it. And then as we have gone down this rabbit hole and our understanding about trauma-informed practice, it's really become much more nuanced. We've really come to the understanding that trauma-informed practice starts with being trauma-informed with ourselves.
Yeah.
So really looking after ourselves. And then the next stage is how can we look after each other? So that is, how do we provide trauma-informed supervision? How can we be trauma-informed in the way that we do staff meetings, in the way that we do team meetings, in the way that we communicate with our colleagues? Even just the incidental, talk over the coffee machine. And only then, when we have created that culture of looking after ourselves and looking after each other, can we actually expect staff to have the capacity to be able to be trauma-informed with our clients. So we kind of talk about this 3-stage thing, and it's so important to look after ourselves. And, for leaders, you want to have that calm nervous system. I think people who've experienced trauma really think they can tune into your nervous system.
Yes.
There's that sense of safety that's kind of in between people. So what I said before about you want to be able to respond without reacting.
Sure.
Like if you have those strategies to be able to hear a disclosure or have a difficult conversation and to be able to respond to that, you need that calm nervous system to be able to do it. And so, we really encourage people when we chose our new office location, we chose one that was like close to a park. We encourage people to, go for a little walk if you need to during lunchtime. We encourage people to, with the wellbeing allowance, it's all about, go have a massage, go buy yourself some sports gear, spend it on some yoga lessons.
Yes.
Do things like that because, we all have a responsibility to keep ourselves well, to be able to bring our best selves to work.
Yes. Okay. No, that's, I think so transferable, not just in our working lives, but also in our home lives too. And I was just thinking about, the calm nervous system that I'm trying to adopt with my 18-month-old daughter sometimes when she's having meltdowns and, getting frustrated about the, not being able to communicate what she needs or what she wants. Or that just resonated in terms of, how transferable that looking after yourself and focusing on your own well-being and how that's a skill.
It's funny you say that actually because Claudia McLean, who used to be the principal solicitor at Women's Legal Centre ACT when we were really first developing these ideas about trauma-informed practice, we both have children that are the same age. Sure. And we were really transferring this is really useful in our parenting.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm just thinking about lots of different, co-regulation and learning about those things. And I think that's it's so useful, even just down to the decision making around where an office is and is there a park located. They're really thoughtful decisions that sometimes often get missed. Often it can be about, overheads and things like that. But, if there is that opportunity to factor that into decision making, it can have such a huge impact on people's day-to-day working lives.
Yeah. Look, I think, in the space that we work, resources is always going to be an issue. But where we can factor these things in, I think can really make a difference. And so, when we go through recruitment, we're really looking for people with those values. So we've got, a finance person who, the bottom line is not necessarily the bottom line. It's kind of like thinking about how can we do the best for our staff.
Oh, that's fantastic. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with anybody?
When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about how trauma-informed practice also really fits really nicely into feminist thinking of, breaking down power imbalances, and being really critical of those dynamics. And I also really like the relational nature of trauma-informed practice and how that collaboration also fits in within Indigenous knowledges and ways of doing things. And I think there's so many important crossovers. So I'd like to kind of create a Venn diagram.
Yes.
and
I'm very visual, so that
these things, fit together.
But I think that's a really important point, is that it's not. I think sometimes the trauma-informed practice and that lens can be focused, as you kind of touched on before, around the client's needs, especially in services, such as women's legal centres. But that principle of collaboration, it's how can services kind of collaborate? How can different marginalised groups and peak bodies, different organisations, come together and actually collaborate to provide that sense of safety, choice, trustworthiness. So it's not just thinking kind of at this, while the interpersonal level is really important, thinking, applying those principles at the system level as well.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to speak with you, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Kasumi. These are complex topics, and I appreciate your willingness to speak so openly about how to support people through disclosures. For those watching, please remember, you don't have to have all of the answers. You don't have to be able to fix everything. However, you must show up with empathy, respect the person's autonomy, believe them, and connect them with appropriate support. And please take care of yourself. Supporting others through trauma is demanding work. You can't pour from an empty cup, so make sure that you have your own support systems in place. We've reached the end of this series, but really this is where your work begins. Creating safe and respectful workplaces isn't a destination. It's an ongoing commitment. It requires courage, humility, and persistence. It requires being willing to acknowledge when things aren't working and to try different approaches. It requires centering the voices and experiences of those most affected by harassment and discrimination. You might feel overwhelmed by everything we've discussed. That's understandable. But please don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Start somewhere. Start with one conversation, one policy review, one intervention when you witness harm. Start by listening more carefully to the people in your workplace who've been trying to tell you something needs to change. This work is urgent and it matters. Every day that workplaces tolerate harassment and discrimination is another day that people are harmed. But every step that you take towards prevention and culture change is meaningful. Every time you speak up, every time you believe someone who discloses to you, every time you hold yourself and others accountable, you're contributing to change. You're not alone in this work. The Working Women's Centre Tasmania, Women's Legal Services Tasmania and Workers Assist are here to support you. We offer in-person workshops that enable you to practice these skills and engage in more in-depth conversations. We have resources available online, and we're a part of a broader movement of people connected to ending workplace harassment and creating genuinely safe, respectful, and inclusive workplaces. I want to acknowledge again that this work exists because of the courage of people with lived experience. People who've spoken up despite the cost, who've shared their stories despite the pain, who've demanded better even when they were met with resistance. We owe it to them to continue this work, to keep pushing for change, and to keep envisioning workplaces where everyone can thrive. So here's my call to action. Don't just watch this series and move on. Take what you've learned and put it into practice. Have the hard conversation. Challenge the status quo. Support the people around you who are already doing this work. Hold yourself and your organisation accountable. And remember, creating safe and respectful workplaces isn't just about preventing harm, though that's crucial. It's about building workplaces where people can bring their whole selves, where diversity is genuinely valued, where everyone has the opportunity to contribute and to flourish. That's the workplace we're all working toward, and you have a role to play in making that real. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Now let's get to work.